Hi, my name is Mike Dillard, and this is Self-Made Man, the podcast for men who want to leave their mark on the world and create a legacy of honor, integrity, and achievement in every aspect of their lives. I'm glad you're here, and once again, it is time to forge your destiny. So there are a few things in life that can affect our emotional state more than sound. The energy that fills your body when your favorite song comes on, or the peaceful state of relaxation that comes from the sound of ocean waves, to the thrill of a Ferrari's exhaust, which I know very well, that lets you know that you're sitting inside a metal beast with 600 horsepower, to the suspense, fear, and anxiety that a few notes can instill during your favorite horror movie, and a particular shark comes to mind. Sound makes emotion, and when it comes to business, emotion makes the sale, and yet the vast majority of us ignore sound altogether. Well, today's episode with our guest Julian Treasure is going to change that. Julian is the founder of the Sound Agency, and the Sound Agency helps companies such as Harrods, Nokia, Honda, and the Waldorf Astoria enhance their brand experience through sound. They can design a music playlist that's tailored for your company and designed to create a specific emotion that you want in your retail location. They can design the jingle or sonic logo used in your company's intro videos, or they can help architects design buildings to reduce noise pollution and unwanted echoes, as they did with Glasgow Airport. Julian has one of the top 10 TED Talks of all time titled How to Speak So That People Will Listen, which has over 17 million views. And today he's going to shine some light on a very important but neglected part of your business that can have a dramatic impact on sales. This is one of the most fascinating and interesting interviews that we've had here on Self-Made Man. And I have to say, after the recording of this episode was done, I became the next client of the Sound Agency as we create our sonic logo and the experience that we want to create here in Self-Made Man moving into the future. So with that being said, please help me welcome Julian Treasure. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Mike Dillard here. And today we're joined by a guest to talk about a topic that has not been discussed really anywhere that I've seen recently in the podcast that I have listened to. It's a subject matter that has not been discussed in any of the episodes here on Self-Made Man, but it is unbelievably important. And that subject really is sound. The sounds of your business, how they're used in your sales and marketing, how they're used in your videos, how they're used in, something like a podcast like this. And also when it comes to having meaningful conversations with your potential customers and your team members and your audience as a whole. So to help us really navigate this unbelievably important topic is one of the best in the world at it, Mr. Julian Treasure, who is joining us all the way from London. So Julian, welcome to Self-Made Man. We're really excited to have you here today.
Well, it's absolutely great to be here. Thanks very much for having me.
Absolutely. So this is actually a topic that I've been in the midst of navigating for my business over the last month. And, specifically when it comes to creating the beginning intro bumper for all of our videos and all of our lessons and the Self-Made brand in general. But before we dive into that specific topic and my questions around that for you, I have to ask, how did you get into this subject matter? Because I think this is something that a lot of people frankly take for granted, but it's unbelievably important and noticeable when the sounds around us disappear.
Definitely. I've always been a musician, and I had a career in marketing before this. In 1988, I launched my own company, having worked in magazine publishing for some years before that. And I grew that company in the UK to become one of the leading, what you call in the US, custom publishers, or we called in the UK contract publishers, producing magazines for clients, which in the early days was a very unusual thing to do. Big brands were saying, we're not a publisher. Now it's very, very common for major brands to produce magazines in order to talk to their customers in a beguiling and interesting and attractive way. And that's what we did. I sold that business in 2003 to a big American marketing group. And I had the opportunity to unify the two halves of me, because all the way through doing that, I'd been listening, and I was conscious the world didn't sound very good, but it was kind of a hobbyist to listening, really. I mean, a musician listens differently to a non-musician, I think, anyway, because if you're playing in a band, you've got to listen to 5 or 6 different things all simultaneously and be very conscious of them. So there's a kind of attentive, conscious, multi-track listening which musicians develop. And I was listening to the world like that all the time and conscious it wasn't great. And when I finally sold the publishing business, I was able to think about why this was the case. Why did the world sound bad? And that was a pretty big question to ask, I guess, Mike, at that time. And the answer really came that most of this noise was being produced by organizations in a very unconscious way. It was like the exhaust gas of the engine of the economy. It was the sound of stuff being done, be that transport, cars, planes, whatever, people in spaces, badly designed buildings with terrible acoustics. There were all sorts of noises going on all around us, mindless music in lots of places where we try to do business or have conversations. And it occurred to me that so much of this was random, accidental, incongruent with visual branding, and downright hostile, a lot of it actually. So I asked myself the question, is this important? Is this having an effect? And I spent a year or two doing a lot of research, and the answer came back very clearly, yes, this is really important. And it's just that brands really hadn't thought about it. So the proposition was born that good sound is good business, and the sound agency was born to carry that proposition out. It was a tough road, I have to say. Years of pre-selling, selling something that people don't know they need. You need to pre-sell. You have to show them there's a need for it first, and it took us some time. Now, this is becoming much more accepted, perhaps helped by the book I wrote and just by stubborn persistence. And we've been joined by quite a lot of other companies around the world doing what is now called audio branding. I guess the sound agency is a bit larger than that because we don't just do branding, we do all of business sound. Nevertheless, there are something over 100 companies in the world doing this. It's growing at 35% a year, give or take. And it's becoming very normal for big brands to ask themselves how their brand sounds. That was not a question that was asked back in 2003, 4, 5. Now I'm very happy to say it is a question that a lot of brands ask. How does our brand sound? They have a great big Bible talking about typefaces and logos and colors. And until just a couple of years ago, you could almost guarantee there were 0 pages in that brand Bible about sound. Now we're just starting to see that change.
Can you give us some examples of some clients that y'all have worked with and kind of some before and after case studies that would illustrate how much of an impact this can make?
Absolutely, yes. We've done some very interesting work over the years. I mean, in spaces, for example, I remember many years ago sitting in front of the chief executive of the British Airports Authority, and they were just about to build Terminal 5 at Heathrow, which is, it's a £3 billion building, which many of your listeners, I'm sure, will have been through. And it's a magnificent construction. And, they were starting the project, and I spoke for about 5 minutes, and he leant forward and said, I cannot believe we're about to spend £3.4 billion on a building, and we have not asked, how is it going to sound? So that's the kind of realization that can come very quickly if we can get in front of the right people, very often C-suite people who really understand, cross-business issues. So we've done work like that, consulting to organizations, helping them to make spaces that sound better. We've worked in retail a lot. You mentioned Harrods, and that was a long project with that magnificent department store, the most famous store in the world, of course. It's like a small town, and they employ more than 10,000 people. It's huge. And they had, I think we audited 170 different spaces in the entire building across the 5 or 6 floors of it. Each space had a different sound going on in it. Very often, it was pretty archaic and pretty random then. They had boom boxes sitting on desks where the staff members were bringing in their own CDs and playing them at work. Or they had very strangely chosen music, in the haute couture department. There was like jungle dance music going on, which, I think was probably relatively inappropriate for the largely ladies of a certain age who are buying those products. So, we encountered a lot of clashes, a lot of music clashing with other music where you could hear 2 or 3 things at the same time, a lot of bad acoustics, a lot of inappropriate sound. And it was a fascinating project to go through the whole store and give them a plan to smooth this out and become consistent and harmonious through the whole store, which worked for a little while until it got sold to completely different owners. And then, unfortunately, a lot of the people we'd worked for changed over, and I think they've pretty much reverted to type now. So I wouldn't advise your listeners to go into Harrods and listen very closely there right now. We've worked with some major brands around the world, some of them not so major now. I mean, we had a tremendous period of engagement with Nokia when they were bestriding the world like a colossus. You know, that's one of those brands. You look back on Nokia, Kodak, you know, you say, wow, they had it in their hands. And then it kind of drifted through their fingers. Nevertheless, at the time, they had one of the world's biggest sonic assets, and that was a little thing called Nokia Tone. I don't know if you've heard Nokia Tone or Nokia Tune, but it's you will recognize it. It's actually a melody that was in a guitar piece, which they used in a TV commercial in 1992, and it was very, very popular. People wrote in and said, what is it? So when they were looking for a ringtone to put into their phones, it was one of the candidates that they had on the list. There were about 5 of them. And it turned out it was the only one that was out of copyright. So it would cost them nothing to use it. So they chose it. And hence, was born, which became the world's most played tune. I calculated for Nokia at its peak, it was being played something like 20,000 times a second somewhere in the world. Now, that's a sonic logo that certainly had some power at the time. And we helped them to develop that to the point where, for example, in the Indian market and the Chinese market, they ran competitions for local composers to come up with local varieties of Nokia tune. Now, that was very innovative. That's basically kind of crowdsourcing your logo. And I can't think of many brands that have had the courage to do that. And the winning composer got $10,000 and they got their version put onto the phones for that territory. So it's been a very interesting ride from some of the world's biggest brands, some of the world's most iconic spaces. We've been able to sensitize people to the fact that sound affects people in powerful ways. It affects our bodies with hormone secretions. It entrains our breathing, our heart rate. It affects our emotions. Music can do that, of course, and so can a lot of other sounds, like birdsong makes people feel secure, for example. It affects our effectiveness and productivity. We all know the difficulty of working when there's somebody talking next to you, or you're in a very loud or complex environment with a lot of sensory stimuli. And it affects also our behavior, largely for the worse. Noise is stressful, and it makes us less sociable. And we tend to move away from it if we can, which is the big lesson we've been teaching retailers. If they make a bad noise in a shop, noise just being unwanted sound is the simplest definition. You make noise in a shop and people will leave faster than they normally would. It's just like having a bad smell in a shop. I mean, that's obviously stupid. And so many shops have cacophony going on in them, which is inappropriate. So it's a question always of thinking about what's appropriate for your business, your brand, and your customers, and designing with the ears as well as with the eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess as a marketer, and for a lot of the entrepreneurs who are listening to this, whose primary goal every day and every month is to sell more of their product or service, for us, that's an emotional process justified by logic, right? The decision to make a purchase is instigated by an emotion and typically justified by logic. And then if you can do both of those successfully, you're going to sell, whatever it is that you're selling. And from an emotional perspective, correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't think of anything more powerful at evoking an emotion than sound. And if you want to kind of play with this or experiment it, just go to YouTube and if you look for, movies, let's just say like the Titanic or horror movies where people have juxtaposed completely opposite music to what's going on the screen, right? So if it's a horror movie, they overlay it with jingles and circus music and just ridiculous stuff. It completely changes the emotion. Or if we just take the sound out of the scene that you're watching completely and it's just on mute, it completely takes away the emotion. So For me in my business, I sell education, I sell information, and that is rapidly becoming commoditized. It grows every single second of every single day. And before you know it, you have 100 different videos of all, types of quality, but good enough on any particular topic. So how do you make your content stand out? How do you make a connection with the other humans that are watching it? And the answer to me is you have to not only provide good information from a logic standpoint, but you also have to evoke an emotion. And ideally, it's a really, it's a pleasant one. It makes the person watching it feel hopeful, inspired, motivated, whatever it may be. But you have to transform that experience into something more than just learning. So that's what I'm thinking about today from my business. How can I take our content and change it in a way that evokes an emotion? How can I use music and sound to do that? Because it's the most effective thing that I can think of. So what kind of comments do you have around that?
Well, I agree with all of that, Mike. The emotional impact of sound in motion pictures is well known. Most directors would acknowledge it's more than half of the emotional impact of the film. And as you rightly say, if you take the soundtrack off, you're left with a very reduced commodity. Interestingly, sound is generally less than 2% of the budget of the film. So they get a lot of bang for buck, actually, from the sound department and the composer and so forth. And yes, I believe the senses are very much the gateways to the emotions. And you're right, the research is showing now that we buy emotionally and we post-rationalize. So very much we need to engage people's emotions. If we want to have brand loyalty of any kind, it's an emotional connection that a lot of people wouldn't be able to vocalize or verbalize specifically, but it's going to have some sort of a connection. And sound is such an important creator of that emotional connection. I mean, I would say scent can do that too. You can get a smell that would take you back to an experience, but equally, probably there's a sound which everybody listening to this can imagine now, which would take them back to their grandmother's house or their grandfather's house or a place in their childhood, which is emotive. Now, it might be somebody's voice, it might be the ticking of a clock, it might be the barking of a dog or a train going past, whatever it might be. Those sounds really immediately key our emotions. And brands very often miss a trick by focusing on appearance and not experience in all five senses. So, I'm a sound guy. I would say sound is vital. All of the senses are vital. And it's a question of congruence between them because they affect one another in a thing called crossmodalities. The senses affect one another and we need to line them up and point them in the same direction. And particularly when you're now talking about an internet-based economy with information products like yours, well, there are a lot of brands out there actually that we only relate to in sound. And yours being one of them, podcasts. I mean, this is sound. But if you think also of your bank, your credit card companies, your utilities, normally your relationship with those brands is on the telephone. You don't see them very often, the odd letter maybe. Much more often you'll talk to them. And that experience can be quite distressing a lot of the time because it's not designed. They have telephone systems where the typical first entry is press 1 for this, press 2 for that. Your spirits immediately sink because none of those are going to be the option you want. And if you do finally get through this nightmare maze of multi-leveled tiers, you might speak to a real person or you might not. And that real person might be in a call center thousands of miles away, or they might not. And they might be on a script or whatever. It's not often a great experience. So yes, sound absolutely is at the heart, I think, of our emotional connection with brands. And at the Sound Agency, we've identified 8 ways in which any brand can express itself in sound. They're not all relevant for every brand. We do consider all 8 of them when we audit a brand, which is what we've done many, many times. So let's go through the 8 very briefly. Your listeners, I think, will probably find this quite interesting. The first is brand voice. Brand voice. Now, that's not metaphorical. I'm not talking about tone of voice like advertising agencies use it. I'm talking about literally, how does the brand sound if you speak to it? How should the brand sound if you speak to it? So you might want to consider things like pace. Is it a very fast and excited brand, or is it very slow and measured? Is it a bit cheeky and informal? Hey, how are you? That kind of. I remember I got on Virgin Atlantic plane just after they launched the brand. And I walked up the steps and the stewardess said, "Hello, sexy," which somewhat surprised me. It's the only time anybody's ever said that to me, actually. Nevertheless, it was very endearing, and it summed up the Virgin brand in 2 words. You know, that brand then, it was a challenger brand. It was cheeky, informal, young, fearless, different, humorous, you know, all of those characteristics that Branson had about him, what he built into that brand. She got that, and she delivered that in 2 words. I don't think she was told to say that. I think she just understood the brand. So that's what I mean by brand voice. We train people in what to say quite often. Here's your script. Here's how you sell. Here's the close, you know, whatever it may be. We don't necessarily train them in how to say it. Are we old or young? Are we polite or impolite? Are we, do we have an accent? Are we masculine or feminine? I mean, these things matter, and it's important to have some consistency in the way that these conversations go, whether it's a corporate receptionist, a telephonist, a salesperson, a business development person, the CEO on a television program, whatever it is, those voices, I think, should have some consistency about them. Next door to brand voice, you've got telephone sound, and I've just talked about that. I mean, I reckon, Mike, I'm serious, I reckon trillions of dollars are lost every year by badly designed telephone sound. I mean, how many of us have slammed the phone down in frustration at one of those dumb systems, not designed by marketing people or customer experience people? Generally, they're designed by technical people. I mean, I'm not being rude about technical people, but they are not customer facing necessarily. And very often those systems leave us in a dead end or don't give us an opportunity to talk to a real person. Older people hate them, and we have an aging demographic in every country in the world. They really need to be looked at because they're losing a ton of business. So telephone sound can be pretty disastrous. Then we've got the most common things that people think we do when I talk about audio branding. You mentioned one already, sonic logo or an audio logo, which is just as your visual logo identifies you. It's a little piece of data compression. It says this is who we are, and it reminds you of the brand experiences you've had. Well, the same applies to a sonic logo. And these can be incredibly significant pieces of DNA. Not right for everybody, I have to say. I mean, we get people phoning us up and saying, "Can we have a bing bong, please?" And that's really not a conversation we're very interested in. We need to go back to the brand, look at the brand architecture, the values, the personality, anything else that's in the basic proposition, the big idea, and then say, okay, is a sonic logo the right way for you to express these things? And if so, what would that be? How would that sound? We've done lots of different types. I mean, I remember for a bank in Colombia, which was rebranding from a very traditional dark blue and gold and marble kind of expression of it was called Banco de Credito then. It rebranded as Helm Bank, helped by the global branding specialist Martin Lindstrom. He went out and worked with them and gave them new corporate values, which were things like humorous and passionate and witty. There was nothing in there about loyal and solid and reliable and so forth. The colors came out as orange and brown and white. The branches looked amazing. We created sound for them. Another specialist created fragrance for them, and it all worked together. And I heard a couple of years ago they got sold to another bank for a big premium, which they put down a lot of to the sensory branding initiative, because their branches became cool places to hang out. You know, they really became iconic in Bogota and all over Colombia. So the sonic logo for them was a whistle. And it was a very unusual. It was, if I can whistle. So it was a jaunty little whistle like that. It was very human, very witty, and very different from the kind of logo you'd expect a bank to have. The staff all liked it so much they all put it on their personal phones as their ringtone. So sonic logo can be enormously powerful. I mean, I can think of another great example, not one from us, but one in France from SNCF, the French train company. And they have a sonic logo, which you would hear if you've ever been in France on a train. You hear it on the train, on their website, on the phone, on the station, before every announcement. It's absolutely everywhere. And it goes, da, 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 like that. And in fact, Dave Gilmour, the guitarist from Pink Floyd, was traveling in France and liked it so much that he created the title track of his latest album around that motif. He got their permission, and that if you listen to that, the whole song is created around that French Sonic logo. So they can be very, very iconic, very popular. The most famous one in the world, of course, is Intel. I mean, I bet not many of the listeners to this could draw the Intel logo, but I'm sure many of them are now thinking, da, 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 da. Everybody knows that.
The one that has entered my world really in the last couple of weeks that I think is just unbelievably iconic, and it's becoming more so. And in fact, it's really become the sound that, in my mind, designates the market, the industry, and the future, which is the Power On sound when you power up a DJI drone. So it has this very melody to it, very iconic melody to it, and has this really cool echo effect. And every single time you hear that noise now, you think drone, you think DJI, and you think the future.
Well, I'm impressed. I don't have a drone myself, but I absolutely get that. And we're speaking on Skype at the moment, and anybody who uses Skype knows that when you fire up Skype, when you call somebody, these are design sounds. These are sounds which are now very iconic and very associated. So you do need time to get a sound associated with a brand. It can be enormously powerful. And as you're saying with a podcast, you need, top and tail stabs, stings, little link sounds, which give it some sort of polish and quality and consistency. And you immediately know that is coming from Mike Dillard. So yes, it's very important. And next door to Sonic logo, we've got brand music. That also can be very important. It can be music that's licensed. And if you've ever flown on British Airways, you will have heard the Flower Duet by Lakme from his opera, by Delibes from his opera Lakme playing. I'm not going to attempt to sing that. It's sung by two sopranos. And it's very beautiful, and BRIE use it absolutely everywhere. So that kind of music can be very, very strong, or it can be composed. Especially composed music is sometimes done. I am not personally a big fan of the corporate song. I've heard some pretty appalling versions in my time of corporate anthems, which are designed to be inspiring. Nevertheless, there are pieces of music which we associate with brands very much. CocaCola being one of the most obvious examples, where they've used songs all the way through the history of Coca-Cola, right from before there was recording. They had sheet music they would put out, and all the way through. I mean, in the 60s, I'd like to teach the world to sing, always Coca-Cola. I mean, all these kind of songs and sounds, right up to the Olympic anthem they used a few years ago, which was called an earworm because it was embedded in a song that was very, very popular. It was number one in many countries, but it was also a piece of advertising for Coke. So brand music, often very, very good. Also, I have to say the most abused and misapplied of all of the sounds. We do a lot of removing mindless music in the sound agency. If you put music into a public space on top of a lot of noise, sadly, that is just more noise. And that's a big mistake that's made in coffee bars, in shops, in shopping malls, in restaurants, all over the world, all the time. Music can be very powerful if it's congruent and appropriate and valuable. If you're running a fashion store, there's a strong relationship between fashion and certain types of music, and it works. Or if you're in a very high-class restaurant, maybe some classical music or some refined jazz works, or, a classy shop selling crystal or something like that. We tend to spend more money on quality things when classical music is playing. That's the evidence of the research. And music can certainly change our shopping behavior. They did a test playing French and German music on alternate days in a supermarket with identical displays of French and German wine. And the purchasing behavior changed radically. On the French music days, people bought more French wine. On the German music days, people bought more German wine. And that wasn't conscious. This isn't people going, German wine, German music, therefore I should buy some German wine. No, it's unconscious. So we need to pay attention to the conditions we're creating for people, make sure it's properly designed and carefully designed so that we're not putting people off. Now, at this point, there'll be a lot of listeners going, is this manipulation? Are we talking about subliminal manipulation of human beings? And I would say to that no more than architects do with visual design for buildings. It's common sense to make buildings pleasant to be in. And I would say it's common sense to make buildings also pleasant for the ears and appropriate sound that's actually supporting you in what you want to do. And I think also it's very important to listen consciously and be aware, look consciously and be aware of what your environment is doing to you at all times. So I think the responsibility is on us also to filter. So let me see, we've dealt with 4 of the 8 brand sound expressions. Let's move on to another one that's kind of next door to brand music, which is exactly what you do, Mike, and that is branded audio. Branded audio being very largely these days podcasts. Some brands have successfully used podcasting. I think it's very, very powerful. And I think we're just really scratching the surface of what podcasting can do. It's kind of next door to radio, isn't it? It's a cousin, if not a sibling of radio. And radio, incidentally, is doing very well all over the world, even with media fragmentation. People love radio. They love the intimacy. They love human voice. They love that human connection. I think that's why podcasting is very powerful. And when you think of it for a major brand, maybe a retail brand, for example, like Harrods, let's just take that case. They never did it, but they could. If you imagine giving each of the department heads the ability to create little podcasts each week, saying this week we've got this special thing happening, and people can subscribe to the bits they're interested in and make that connection while they're doing the ironing or having a bath, or, that's the joy of sound, isn't it? You can do something else while you're listening. Then you create that emotional connection, and people will have little light bulbs going off going, that's brilliant. I must go in this week and do that thing. And it's personal. It's so much more powerful than email marketing or letters or advertising even. So that's branded audio. Then we've got product sound. Now, we don't do a lot of that, but it is very significant. If you're selling, I don't know, a Harley Davidson, I think the sound might be a factor there, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a car guy, and I spend a lot of money on cars, and half of the decision on which car I buy is determined by the exhaust.
Absolutely. You just have to watch Top Gear or the new version now. And every time they put their foot down and their eyebrows go up, it's the sound that does it, isn't it? So Ferrari on their website, you can go and listen to different types of Ferraris. And that's very sensible for them. Of course, much less important with a pair of pants or a tin of beans. Nevertheless, every product really has got a name. It may have sound associated with its use. I mean, if I say Bacardi, you probably immediately think of party noise and Latin music. Brands can own territory in sound. So I've always wondered why, for example, there isn't a bacon brand that owns the sound of sizzling. Now, maybe some of the listeners may be thinking, hey, hang on, we could own the sound of this territory that we operate in. And that would be a very sensible question to ask and exploration to undertake. So that's product sound, and it can change people's perceptions enormously. I mean, there was a test where there was a bunch of hairdryers and people rated them on looks. And then when they turned them on, the rating table turned absolutely upside down because the one that people thought looked the best sounded absolutely terrible. Another great example is leaf blowers. They tried to market quiet leaf blowers in the US, and people didn't buy them because there was an association of power with noise.
I don't think they're strong enough.
No,
interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I'd assume, this is a hunch, maybe you'll have the answer, but when I think of sounds that I just stand out to me, one of them is when you hear a sound of CocaCola open, it's quite distinctive as opposed to any other kind of canned beverages. And I'm assuming they've put thought and effort into that and probably overpressurizing the can just a little bit to give it that snap pop, right?
Yeah, very possibly. Brands have trademarked sounds. Harley Davidson did try to trademark the sound of their V-twin, but there's a Yamaha that has a similar sound, so the judge didn't allow it. But Kellogg's did trademark a crunch. So there is a trademarked Kellogg's crunch. And I have no doubt that Coca-Cola, whether through any of their sub-brands, probably have got some very tight controls over the noise that their product makes. And that can be very significant. I mean, I'll give you another amusing example. The product Axe or Lynx, depending on which country you're in. And so a deodorant, I think in America it's Axe, isn't it?
Yeah, that's correct.
When CFCs were banned, the chemical that was in aerosols, the product went from going to going, and the customers started to complain the thing is not working anymore. It's not as strong as it used to be. It's useless. So they spent a lot of money repackaging without CFCs. Now it goes again. It's working fine again. So the sound of the packaging affects how well people think the product itself is working. So it can be very significant, product sound. Then let's move on to soundscapes. This is a particular speciality for us at the sound agency. It's where we've kind of focused our work over the last 6-7 years, I guess. Sound in spaces, specially branded spaces, whether that be shops, restaurants, hotels, airports, shopping malls, all sorts of different spaces. We've focused on auditing those spaces. We go in and listen to them. We produce audit reports, and we help brands to improve the sound, because so often, and a lot of this, to be honest, is common sense. So often we'll go in and there's an appalling cacophony in a shopping mall, which is because the acoustics are bad in the first place. The architects just didn't think about acoustics, so they designed something that's, the size of a cathedral with glass and steel and concrete and marble and whatever. And not surprisingly, every sound bounces around and it becomes 70, 75 decibels and just makes people stressed and unhappy. Or it can be simple things like clunking escalators or doors that slam, or tenants that have music turned up too loud that's polluting the whole place. There's a lot of simple things that can be done to improve sound. And if we design it from the ground up, we can start to make spaces that sound as good as they look and that we really all enjoy being in. So that's soundscapes. Have I covered all 8? I can't remember now.
I think that was 7. I could be wrong.
Okay. What are we missing? We've done voice, telephone, sonic logo, music, branded audio, product sound, soundscapes. Oh, advertising sound is the last one.
Cool.
We don't really get involved very much, and I would broaden that out to say marketing communication sound these days, because this would cover things like videos on YouTube and viral communications and so forth. Rather different from podcasting, I think. Tend to be short form, and it's sync audio to video. Very important too. Important to be consistent. What we often find with advertising agencies is they're a little bit blown by fashion, and it can be that the creative director's favorite track at the moment gets put in, or that they stick in a track by Sting or somebody as just a tester, and by the time the commercial's been seen by the client and everybody else, it's unthinkable to have it with anything else, and they have to go out and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to license that very track. So sound tends to be a little bit of an afterthought, and it tends to be a little bit inconsistent. It's ad by ad instead of campaign by campaign, or even better, the whole brand consistent through time. And that's, it's a combination of voice and music and sound effects. So those are your 8. And at the center, really, we always recommend creating some brand sound guidelines. So that's thinking about all of the 8. Are they relevant for us? If they are, what are the guidelines so we get some consistency here and we express ourselves in a consistent way, consistent with the visuals, as well as consistent over time and in space, of course, in different places. That's really at the heart of what we do. And I think most brands can gain enormously by gaining that consistency and quality of approach instead of a kind of random shotgun approach of just making lots of noise.
Yeah, absolutely. So from a tactical or practical standpoint, again, this is something that I am actively trying to figure out for Self-Made Man, and we're going to start putting out a lot of videos here in the coming months, and I need to figure out a little intro bumper, right? And a great example is the intro for all of the TED videos. They've got their signature, 6-second intro with the water drop and then the drums and kind of their experience. And you hear that, you immediately know you're watching a TED video. So where can I go get one of those created without having to rely on my intuition or my best guess or, an outsourcer's best guess? Is that something you guys can help us with at the sound agency? But how do I get that done? Because that is really something I have to honestly, accomplish here in the coming weeks.
Well, far be it from me to sell to you in front of hundreds of thousands of people, Mike. But yes, of course, I'd be absolutely delighted to have that conversation with you. We have wonderful resources who can create amazing sounds of all kinds. Some of the guys we work with, I mean, we don't have a studio because we're very determined to be transparent. And a lot of the audio branding agencies make the mistake of having a studio with two guys working in it, or two people working in it. And that kind of colors it because they're the same people doing it over and over again. We like working with freelance people and choosing the right person for the right thing. Some of the people we work with do game sound, for example. And, film sound used to be the pinnacle of sound design in the world. Now it's game sound. Some games, if you unroll them, they're hours and hours and hours with thousands and thousands of bespoke sound effects, which have been put together by very, very clever people using all sorts of different recordings and different production techniques. So these are very clever people, and it's a joy to work with people like that, as well as some fabulous music composers. So yes, of course, we'd be delighted to have that conversation with you, Mike, and we might do a mates rate for you. And, for anybody listening to this, there are companies out there who will do this. I mean, I would advise shop around, listen to their show reel, have a look at their experience, make sure that they have some sort of experience in doing this. And it's not just a composer. You might have a friend who's a great composer who can create something wonderful for you for next to nothing. That might work. There is a bit of science in this, however, and it does need a sensitivity to the brand. So it isn't just a creative process. It's also a scientific process. It's the merging of science and art. We need to understand the brand personality, the brand architecture, really, in order to derive sound that's going to be appropriate and effective.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, just look at, the Candy Crush app, right? I've read articles where that app's made billions and billions of dollars, and it's largely as a result of the attention that went into the sound effects that become just this addictive feedback loop, kind of like a slot machine. Every time you win at a slot machine or something like that, you get that audible feedback, the visual feedback, and it just becomes kind of like crack to the brain, and it's addictive, and it's a very conscious part of the experience, that has resulted in the success that it has had.
Definitely. I mean, I would say also there's a kind of ecology about sound, because sound is very powerful. And I'm not a great fan, for example, of casinos where you get no light, you get no reference to the outside world, and you get this kind of dominant cacophony of machines. Same in arcades, where you're putting people into some sort of a trance, really. And I think we need to be careful about exposing people to noise like that. I mean, there are arcades we've audited where the noise level is 90, 95 decibels, and there are 4-year-olds in there. That is not healthy. Definitely not healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Julian, this has been a fascinating episode for me personally, and I'm sure for everybody here listening, because this is not a topic that is talked about often, because frankly, I don't think there's a lot of experts like yourself in this industry. So it's unbelievably refreshing to get an education on this and to understand the importance of it and the impact that it makes on branding and, again, creating that emotional experience for your customers. So where can people go to connect with you, like myself, if they're interested in hiring the sound agency to help them with their branding? And then also, how can they connect with you and follow you personally on social media?
Well, a couple of things, Mike. First of all, I have a book called Sound Business, pun intended, and that was published back in 2007, and then a second edition in 2009. It was also translated into Japanese, actually, by Yamaha. Now, people who are interested in this topic, by all means, you can grab a copy of the book on Amazon. It's available. It's still out there, and it's everything I knew, and pretty much everything I still know about using sound in business effectively. So our whole conversation, but over about 200 pages with lots of detail and references and so forth. That's the first and most obvious thing. The sound agency, it would be delighted to hear from anybody. We're always delighted to talk to new customers, and that's www.thesoundagency.com. And you can see stuff about us also on YouTube, and we can share case studies from all over the world. And then personally, my website, juliantreasure.com, That's more focused on personal sound, because over the last couple of years, I've done a lot of work around speaking and listening, individual sound. It occurred to me that, brands are making all this sound, but so are we as people. And we need to take some responsibility for that. And in fact, the two TED Talks about speaking and listening have been the most popular of all of them. The speaking one is now in the top 10 of all time. And it has 4 times as many views as the listening one, which tells me something. And that's significant, isn't it?
Sure.
I think listening is a very important skill. I think speaking is very important. I'm writing a new book called How to Be Heard, which will be out at the end of this year. And if anybody's interested in becoming a more powerful speaker, whether on a stage or just, to your loved ones, then, by all means, pop by juliantreasure.com and log in and just let us have your email address, and we'll keep you posted on that book and then any materials that I develop over this year about powerful speaking and conscious listening. So those are the ways, really. The book Sound Business, the Sound Agency's website, my personal website. Be really delighted for any connections with any of your listeners.
Fantastic. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for the time today. This was truly enlightening, and I look forward to following up with you on my needs personally, and this has been a pleasure. So thank you so much again.
Pleasure's all mine, Mike. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you next week. Take care.